My first question is sort of, if my European history class has taught me anything, Russian foreign policy has been largely decided by warm water ports. That's dictated sort of their foreign affairs for a long time. One of the theories behind this is that Putin wanted to ensure he would have access to the ports in Crimea. Do you think this is a fair sort of link?
To be honest, I totally disagree with this.
Okay.
It was relevant maybe in the 19th century, the warm ports and everything. So right now it's more about geopolitics.
Okay.
So he wants to keep NATO away from Russian borders. That's the first thing. And the second thing, it's lamentation of this imperial glory that was gone. You know, remember his phrase that the collapse of Soviet Union was the a worst geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. And it's like, imagine a person who lost his or her hand, you know, and it still aches, you know, even if the hand is not there, you know. That's what Russians feel, a lot of them, because he was overwhelmingly supported by Russians. You know this?
Yeah.
So it wasn't just, of course, there's a lot of propaganda right now. It's one-sided, so this Russian cause is good, Ukrainian cause and Western cause is totally bad. But even let's put aside propaganda, so he does enjoy this overwhelming support when he tries to build muscles. It's imperial glory also, so it's hard to part with this, you know. So I don't think it's about warm ports. The first Crimean War between the Russian Empire on the one side and England and France on the other side was about warm ports, because England and France tried to restrain Russian access to the so-called warm ports. Russia was the major grain producer at that time. Okay, and they stepped in basically because the goal was to penalize Russia. Okay, to block Russia as a major grain shipper to Europe. You know, there were other considerations, like you said, the geopolitical goal, warm ports. It was important at that time. If you go through this access through the Black Sea, anywhere you control the situation. But essentially, it was about access to warm ports at that time from a viewpoint of economics. Okay, so Russian grain producers could overwhelm Europe with grain, and the prices could drop. So there was one of the major things was the pure economic considerations. So nobody talks about it. Okay, there was a desire to keep Russia as a grain producer bottled into this within the surface empire.
So the Soviet Union, as Putin obviously supported it through that statement, also had a long history of intervention, and so we had the very minor Georgian War in 2008, and now this Crimean intervention. Do you think this might be part of Putin's trying to bring back the pride of Russia?
That's what I'm talking about.
Okay.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying. That he wants to bring to restore Russian national honor. If you go to Russian bookstores, you will see that a bunch of books about how Russia's rising from her knees and regaining power, because it was a humiliation. So it was to many people it was a humiliation, the collapse of Soviet Union, because there was no military defeat. But on the other hand, the empire collapsed. And a lot of people who don't know about economics, nothing, you know, this average person, it's just they watch TV or whatever picture they see, you know, they make up their judgment about the world. So they think that there were some evil forces that, it's a mainstream opinion, there's some evil forces that contributed to the collapse of Soviet Union. So like CIA, United States, Jews, that were the most favorite.
So do you think this is sort of their way of poking at the West?
Yeah, poking the West and showing to themselves we're powerful. Okay, because they do not have military power to challenge the West, but at the same time they still want to kind of flatter themselves with this idea. One of the recent hits on the news in Russian media, there is an anchor in Russia, his name is Kiselov. He said, we're still powerful, we can evaporate the United States by using our nuclear weapons. And of course, everybody was happy to hear this. I guess he caught something that resonates with the mainstream Russian psyche. And so we were abused, we lost the empire. Now we are restoring our glory. And that's the way to show. That's the way to show. Okay, that's a spiritual, cultural, and geopolitical goal, if you wish. And the same thing was a Georgian-Russian war. Okay, although Georgian-Russian war was more complicated because Georgians were the first to fire shots.
Okay.
Don't forget about it. Okay, so they had a good cause because Russians did want to kind of two Georgian republics to secede, but Georgians decided to kind of do preventive attack, to occupy these areas which were about to secede. It's like imagine Ukrainian troops overtaking Crimea, trying to prevent Russian invasion. Okay, so in Ukraine, it's clear-cut situation in terms of geopolitics. So Russian troops come there without any insignia, with so-called green man, famous Putin's green man. It was military intelligence special forces. GRU, it's the chief intelligence, military intelligence. Okay, they invaded it. So here it's clear.
Do you think, as you already mentioned, there's a lot of comparisons to Hitler and the Nazis, where they use this sort of same justification with the Sudetenland. Do you think that is an accurate comparison?
To some extent, yeah. And it's always hard to draw parallels. History never repeats itself. But at the same time, as I think I mentioned it once, history is a chaos, and you never know, it never repeats itself. But at the same time, there is a certain kind of element of repetition, at least to me, it does look like we have a similar pattern, I don't want to completely put them on the same plane, but look, in case of Germany, we have what? We have Anschluss, Olympics, Anschluss, right? In the same pattern here. We have Georgian War, Anschluss of these republics. We have Olympic Games, by the way, don't forget. Olympic Games. And now we have another Anschluss, Anschluss of Crimea. And Olympic Games, don't underestimate it, because it gave him such a power. He built up his muscles so well, because it was such a big coup for Putin, that he was overwhelmed with his success. He believed that in sports, he is a big sports fan, so Russia could regain her glory. And the same thing, Hitler, 1936, Olympic Games, it was a signature event for Hitler. So he was just empowered by these Olympic Games. All athletes from all over the world coming to this Germany, that new country that was rising from her knees, regaining power. And 2 years later, Sudetenland, occupying Sudetenland, and then entering Czechoslovakia and occupying Czechoslovakia. So here we see the same patterns. So again, like with Hitler, at first it was Austria, right? 1934. In case of Putin, it was Georgian War. Then Olympic Games. And then we have Sudetenland, and in case of Putin, we have Crimea. And right now, the Russian troops, they're clustered around the Ukrainian borders. So basically, they're ready to invade the eastern part of Ukraine, populated by Russians or Russian-speaking Ukrainians. See, it's a similar situation. In what case, in what sense it's similar? Because in both areas we have similar-speaking people. Like in Sudetenland, we have Germans, and in Crimea, we have 60% of Russians who really want to be part of Russia, and Crimea traditionally was this like a outpost of Russian imperialism. Okay, a borderland that was seized by Russia in the 18th century, as you know, during Catherine the Great. Crimea was taken from Turks, right? And was made like into an imperial outpost in the Black Sea. So 60% of Russians, they culturally link themselves to Russians. Of course, they want to be there. And I'm sure if they had a chance to have like a free referendum, they might have voted to join Russia anyway. Yeah?
So you think that among the Crimeans, I mean, a lot of people have called into question actually how true the election results or the referendum results were, but you think that the Crimeans probably would have voted to join anyway without any kind of...
You know what? No. Because Putin's Russia stirred them.
Oh, okay.
Stirred them. Without this, they already had an autonomy in Ukraine. Don't forget about it. And nobody abused them, nobody discriminated against them. And you couldn't even discriminate against them because 60% of people in Crimea were Russians. Plus 15% were Crimean Tatars. And only minority of people were Ukrainians, okay? They could have, again, it's a hypothetical situation, they could have voted for extension of this autonomy. But nobody even posed the question to secede at that time from Russia. It's only an exterior force that empowered them, okay? They told them, we are going to be with you. And they started to kind of instigate it. But it wasn't totally Putin Russia. It was also new Ukrainian leadership. You remember how the recent history developed quickly, in a cinematic way. So we have this corrupt president, pro-Russian, who was elected. Legitimately. He was dislodged illegitimately. Again, I sympathize with these Ukrainian revolutionaries, but as a result of their revolution, they dislodged him, okay? Which already upset the eastern areas because he was more a candidate of Russian-speaking areas, okay? So it upset them, and look, next blunder of this new Ukrainian leadership that represented more Ukrainians who lived in western part of Ukraine and in central Ukraine. The first measure, American media doesn't mention it, the first measure they adopted is that Ukrainian language is the only language in Ukraine. You probably heard about it since you looked into this. And in the response to this, we have this indignation in eastern part of Ukraine, in Crimea, and Putin stepped in, started to instigate it more, and then he sent his green man, which empowered these people. So that's the rest is history.
Do you think that Putin observed this more opportunistically, or do you think he had some kind of long-term goal in terms of maybe a more disjointed Ukraine? Maybe not Crimea in particular, but more just greater Russian influence on Ukraine.
I don't think it was a plan. It was a spontaneous decision. Look how events developed. Because Yanukovych, this president, this corrupt guy, he was his puppet. So he thought he had his man there. But as it turned out, he couldn't control the situation. So he was out, and Putin was mad at him. He even said, I don't like him during his press conference. He is not a good president. He lost the control of the situation. And I agree with these people, and he might be corrupt, but he was legitimately elected, so he had a point here. And I guess somewhere deep inside, again, it's hard to go through somebody's mind, he was upset that he lost control of the situation. And when this new Ukrainian leadership started kind of making steps in favor of Ukrainian nationalism, he said, okay, so you want to do it? Now you will get it, because there was a movement of people against this in eastern areas, and he stepped in. I think it was a spontaneous decision, like made on a whim, So all these quick decisions. I think he himself was hostage of the situation. It's the same like Hitler, when in Sudetenland, when he first entered Austria, Then after the Olympic Games, he felt empowered, and all Germans wanted to be part of Germany. This great experiment Hitler was pursuing, empowering Germans. And then when some leaders in Sudetenland started asking questions, Czech leadership, so give us more autonomy and so forth and so forth, Hitler stepped in and started giving them passports. That was his first thing. He started giving them German passports to Sudeten Germans. And Putin did the same thing. Mm-hmm. He started giving passports to Ukrainians. Mm-hmm. And naturally, you become a hostage of the situation. So originally, Crimean people, actually, they said, we're going to declare like independence. We would be an independent. But since Putin started giving them passports, they already were moving in the direction of Russia. So we're going to join them. It's amazing to watch Russian TV, how it's just a nationalistic wave. Mm-hmm. It's just a craze, Mm-hmm. The entire nation is united around Putin. His ratio of popularity is 70% right now. It's 10% more than it was before Crimea. Can you imagine? What again? Before you ask your questions, well, let me ask you a question. Is it okay? Huh?
Yeah.
Like, for instance, what do you see in U.S. media? How U.S. media covers this? Maybe you watch TV. So, what is your impression?
Personally, I honestly don't watch a lot of TV.
Internet.
I read mostly.
What do you read?
I read mostly online, and I do try my best.
Me too. I don't watch TV.
I do try my best to avoid more biased. Of course, whether or not I notice its bias is questionable. But I do think a lot of United States media is slanted a little bit towards the Ukrainians, the revolutionaries.
Yeah.
I think a lot of the time it is. A lot of the time, it is sort of portraying them as the underdogs and the Russians coming in and oppressing them. Of course, they have there's a kernel of truth in there, but I think they overplay a lot of it. I think, especially with the Crimean referendum. Now, they did report something like over 90% of people voted for it, which sort of calls the results into question a little bit. But I think the fact that they're calling it absolutely ridiculous is a little bit out of the question. I think a majority would have won. The fact that it was 90% does give them a little bit of an edge there. From the sources I read online, I read AP, Al Jazeera, BBC. They seem fairly unbiased, but when you get away from those and you get into the TV, it does get get very biased.
See, I have the reason I ask you because I had the impression that some U.S. media, at least I read Yahoo News, that the CNN, Fox News. See, I try to be on both sides. I have this impression that these news outlets, it's both on the left and on the right, they treat Ukraine as a country that is located, let's say, somewhere, I don't know, in Asia, that was suddenly invaded by Russia, So they treat it legalistically. So from a legalistic point of view, Putin, of course, 100% wrong, yeah? So he sees the territory of independent country, which is dangerous precedent, because it might open the Pandora's box. What is next? Because we have some Russian minorities in Lithuania, Estonia. What if they are discriminated? So does it mean that Russian troops should enter? Even this Belarusian dictator, Lukashenko, the last dictator of Europe, he is worried right now. He said we need to beef up our military muscles because you never know. Because what if Putin decides to overrun us? So that's and other nations might think the same way. So we might break this legalistic. So from this viewpoint, so United States or this media outlets, they're totally right, But there's a certain reality, We can't. It's like a theory in history, It's the same thing. Like, see, this is one side, They are right from this pure legalistic viewpoint. He shouldn't do it. It should have been done in a different way. Okay, and it's in the same thing. Like I told you, Ron Paul, when he said, "Oh, it's a good thing." It's on the other side. See, we have one side, this kind of right and left mainstream media outlets. On the other side, we have this libertarian viewpoint. When Ron Paul endorsed this referendum, he said it's a good thing because secession is needed, and I personally agree with this. In theory. As long as secession, as I told you, it was done with white gloves, But it never happens in reality. It's always in somebody's favor, You cannot have this sterile situation as a lab experiment when referendum is policed by both sides and people are given really free choice. There was no free choice in this case, So in this case, it was rigged. It's another question. They would have won anyway, probably, because it's 60%. But how they would have voted? Maybe they would have voted being part of federation. So we don't know.
I do remember the two options were to either or to be independent or join Russia. There was no option to stay.
See, that's all. Exactly. It's already rigged. So I totally disagree with Ron Paul in this case. We cannot endorse it as some kind of ideal libertarian secession, down to a tiny area. And another thing, we shouldn't forget this cultural links between Ukraine and Russia. They're so tight, it's unimaginable. For instance, one thing like Central Asia and Russia, it's totally different cultural realms. It's a Muslim area. It's a racial, it's cultural difference, it's linguistic differences. It's totally different mentalities, right? Or let's take Baltic countries and Russians. A short, brief stay within Russia, mutual animosity, They always felt part of Europe, I remember in Soviet Union, they never felt linked to Russia. So different culture, different languages, not many connections. But in case of Ukraine, it's the same people almost, Even linguistically, Ukrainian language is similar, Let's put aside these eastern areas. Let's just take Ukrainian language proper, and it's very similar to Russian. Even without learning Ukrainian, I can understand like 30% of what they're speaking. It's almost like Portuguese and Spanish. It's impossible to separate them. So we shouldn't. It's like imagine U.S. and Canada to some extent. In many respects, it's the same cultural link. Okay.
This actually leads into one of my next questions. With Ukraine, there's obviously not full 100% support among Ukrainians for the new government. Some Ukrainians, at least, and then obviously, especially in the East, do feel stronger ties towards Russia. Do you think it's these cultural links that sort of cause this? In most former Soviet republics, I think a vast majority of the people are very wary of Russian influence, especially in the Baltics. And as you mentioned, these cultural links in the Baltics aren't very strong. Do you think it's these links that make Ukrainians more willing to, or are maybe more susceptible to Russian influence?
Of course. They have. They watch, not now they cut the TV channels, but they watch TV of each other, Russians and Ukrainians, especially in borderland areas, Eastern Ukraine, they were tuned to Russian channels. They were reading Russian newspapers, listening to radio stations. If right now, through some, on internet, I go to some Ukrainian radio stations, it's a mix. They use Russian and Ukrainian language. There's music stations, they constantly switch back and forth. The songs they play, rock bands, it's almost 70% Russian rock bands. It's amazing. That's what I noticed because I do like rock music, jazz music, and I go. That's another thing that stunned me. Books, print media. Like almost half of the print media in Russian. Okay, how can you dismiss it? See, such thing doesn't exist in Baltic. Okay, so totally dissociate. They either publish books. It's very important in their native language or in English. What they do in European EU, European Union, native language or English. So there's no Russian language there. In Ukraine, it's Ukrainian and Russian. See?
Why do you think something like this hasn't, or why do you think there hasn't been some sort of secessionist feel before among the eastern regions in Ukraine? Why do you think they've been willing to be part of Ukraine still, if they're so very Russian?
Well, it's they went by administrative borders. When the Soviet Union fell apart, everything happened so suddenly. They decided to avoid any kind of, at that time they thought, complicated issues. They decided to go by administrative borders. See, in the Soviet Union, these republics had administrative borders, okay, which geopolitically nobody took seriously at that time, right? For instance, Ukraine was extended under Soviets, so eastern, the Russian-speaking areas were added. Crimea was added by Khrushchev, by the way. Talking about Khrushchev, in 1950s or 1960s, I forgot exactly.
I think it was 54.
54. And in fact, one of the Ukrainian nationalists who lived in West Germany at that time, Stepan Bandera, he said it's the worst thing that could have happened with Ukraine, that Khrushchev added Crimea, because it would become in future the apple of discontent. Yeah? And exactly this thing happened. Yeah? So he artificially added it to Ukraine before it was part of Russia, Crimea. Okay, and since after Soviet Union collapsed, they signed this quickly agreement. President of Russia, future president of Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and others. And they just decided, let's go by administrative borders. And that was it. The end. And they didn't even think about some people being there who have more links with Russia in case of Eastern Ukraine than with Western Ukraine. Okay, they even have different names. Eastern Ukrainians have different names for Western Ukrainians. They call them Zapadenцы. Zapadenцы, it's nickname for Western Ukrainians. Zapadenцы, it means Westerners. Westerners. So it's a people with totally different mentality, mindset, because they were part of Poland, or before part of Austro-Hungarian Empire. They were more like a Catholic, or there was a branch of Russian Orthodox Church called Uniate Church. They were different church. It's like half Catholic, half Russian Orthodox. Okay, see, it's a religious differences. You can't just cut Ukraine in half. Western part would be like pro-European, pro-Catholic, so to speak, or the special branch of Russian Orthodox. Eastern part, it's a part of Russian Orthodox Church, Russian-speaking, just cultural bridge. Although many people speak both languages, it's I don't know, probably 20% of people they're the offspring of mixed marriages. Where should they go? So that is why I always say that self-determination should be taken to the individual level. So let people decide. That is why I have these arguments with this. Both on the left and on the right, who some leftists peddle this. Let's not go there, because otherwise American political pundits will crucify me. Okay.
And so, fairly recently, maybe in the past couple of weeks or so, some of the Crimean Tatars are calling for autonomy for themselves. And a few of them have expressed fears of possible ethnic cleansing, whether it be violent or not. Even the Turkish government came out in support of them. Do you think this is a possibility? I feel like they might be basing this on the persecution they faced in the Soviet Union.
It's a fear. It's the same, like, I call it Jewish factor. It's the same thing, like Holocaust happened with Jews, right? And to the present day in the Jewish mind, this fear of any kind of hint, of any kind of verbal, political, is frequently interpreted as the kind of a sign of looming Holocaust. Same thing with Crimean Tatars, because this memory of this horrible exile experience when the entire group of Crimean Tatars, entire nationality was exiled by Stalin, right? Mm-hmm. And it was only under Khrushchev they were able to get back. So I think it's unfounded fear. Of course, nobody will cleanse them. I don't think so. In fact, to kind of butter the butt, so to speak, Russian government promised them they would get like 20% of representation in a local Crimean parliament. Mm-hmm. I don't know how they're going to do it, because it's another kind of, it might open another can of worms, because the nationalities in Russia, like Tatars, Altai people, Buryats, you name them, they might say, why don't we have the same thing? But in this particular situation, they want to kind of butter them up, because Crimean Tatars ignored the referendum. They didn't mm-hmm. come for it, right? Mm-hmm. Because they felt more comfortable being with Ukrainians, precisely because of this painful history. We don't want to be with Russians. We would rather be with Ukrainians, because at least we feel kind of secure. And now, look, it's a funny thing. They go to Turkey and ask them, help us. Again, it's a funny hypothetical version. What if we have Turkish troops, coming to the Crimean Peninsula and saying, hey, there is a looming threat, for Crimean Tatars, there are some kind of green man, from Turkey, without any chevrons, who want to protect them. We're going to do a referendum in the Crimean Tatar area, so let's secede, I'm all for it. As long as the secession is done with clean hands and white gloves. Mm-hmm. Who's the next?
Mm-hmm. And for me, this is the most confusing point. Mm-hmm. Russia has been, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, has been on sort of a increasingly important economic role. They're mm-hmm. Ingratiating themselves with Europe through the natural gas and all that. And now Putin seems to be risking it. There's been a lot of financial flight from Russia. Why do you think he was willing to risk? Do you think he understood the economic repercussions, or do you think he might have some sort of long-term goal out of getting Crimea?
So you are, as far as I understand your question correctly, it's not only about Crimea. You are speculating. Maybe it's some kind of long-term goal, since he wants to
I just
gamble on this, What is the point,
That I
to
feel like
jeopardize everything, whatever
yes.
was accumulated for the past 20 years, Russia becoming part of global
yes.
economic community.
I feel like Crimea is such a small price, or such a small piece, that losing all of this progress.
See, that shows again how ideology is important, Since there is no ideology in Russia right now, what is this? Is nationalism, Mm-hmm. And since the country is insecure, the Crimea, it's a sign of Russian insecurity, This lamentation about the loss of empire, and you become a prisoner of your own nationalism, okay? And eventually, again, it shows again that how powerful nationalism, Mm-hmm. It's remember how after Twin Towers were destroyed, how briefly, at least for 5-6 months, Mm-hmm. Americans on the left and the right, get together around the bush, our saviors, so let's go and bomb somebody. There was a feeling, this kind of patriotic friends. And unfortunately, Americans are individualistic enough not to respect it. But in other countries, they don't have this individualistic tradition. They got used to this crazy collectivism, I call it. It's ingrained in Russian tradition or in other countries' tradition. So it's hard to resist this nationalist tide, I see it. At first, it shocked me a few years ago when the Russians won over Netherlands during a soccer game, It was June 3 or 4 years ago. I was a little shocked in the city where I stayed. The entire city was just celebrating with Russian flags, screaming Russia, Russia, Russia. That's the kind of stuff, you know. And so he gives them power, and he is he's like this weak giant, like a tick, you know. He empowers himself, you know. He feels the blood is kind of getting into his veins, you know. Don't forget, there's a personal reason for this, because he accomplished whatever he wanted. So right now, he already is kind of abusing his power, you know. Although he tries to do it through constitutional means. You know. See, he was president, he stepped out, but at the same time he prepared a seat for himself. So now he's coming back, and now he works for history. So now he is more thinking about posterity, you know. So don't forget about this. So that is why I think he's a reasonable man, not Neanderthal. He knows foreign languages, a very educated man. But like Lord Acton said, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, because it's a one-man rule right now, more or less. So he already thinks about himself as a person who works for history, who can do something for Russia. So it's not only about economics. It's more about ideology, his place in history, and like a place of Russian history. That's what he clearly thinks about this right now, you know, during his third term. I think that's the whole thing. Nationalism, that Soviet elite becomes prisoner of this nationalistic wave. You know, you cannot resist it, right? You can't. It's like a herd of bisons. You know, there's a stampede and they run toward the cliff. You know, so they're even ready to jeopardize their economic ties with Western banks. Right now, for instance, Russian central bank is talking about creating this independent credit card system, because when MasterCard and Visa tried to, like for a few days, cut them from Western financial credit institutions, so they said, hey, we're going to separate ourselves. You see, it's it. Plus, don't forget, Russia was isolated. I remember we talked about it for 70 years, right? It's still there. You cannot beat it. Only like a tiny, meager percent of Russians traveled outside. They still watch TV. They think the whole world is against them. You know, we talked about it. Yeah? So it's you know this.
Do you think that is perhaps changing?
It's just slowly, but changing. The only hope is that there's new professionals in capital cities like St. Petersburg, Moscow. They might kind of be like a cushion. You know,
with and along with that, just sort of the access to information, like internet.
Yeah, internet is powerful. But again, who has internet? It's only 20% of Russians have access to internet. And it's on more or less regular basis, you know. The rest of people, they even don't know about it. There are some areas in Russia who don't have access to internet.
Do you think we'll see perhaps increased democratization of Russia as these young people rise in power? Yeah,
I mean, in fact, I think everything will be moving quickly. You know, you will be shocked. You know how, because right now the world is so interconnected. See, by trying to kind of cater to the ghost of the past, you don't realize that you cannot do this in a modern day environment. We're so linked. You know. For instance, for Hitler, it was easy to do, right?
For me, this is the whole thing. That, I feel like
autarky, isolating. Remember, everybody isolating each other from each other. Like FDR isolated economically, United States customs barriers, which provoked the Germans and Italians. Yeah? Germans, Italians created this autarkic system, isolation. Russia isolated herself under Stalin. So at that time, it was still possible, and that is why Hitler became who he became. Yeah? In fact, I will tell you some story. This has nothing to do on the surface with what we're talking about. I was always thinking why Hitler was so hooked on this Russian communism as a Jewish Mason plot. And I think I told you about it during one of our lectures. In 1941, when he invaded Russia, he issued this order to kill Jews and commissars, you know. Although by that time the Soviet Union was totally different from what it was in the early 1920s. There were hardly any Jewish people in leadership. Remember we talked about it, and which convinced me that he lived by certain stereotypes, because there were hardly any links, except some trade relationships. There were no media links between Russia and Germany. So whatever he observed from white Russians who lived in Munich in 1920, 1919, you know, that told him, oh, look, like 70% of Jews are among the Bolsheviks, he still shared these stereotypes. Right now, with this internet, when you cannot totally block it, you know, you cannot do it, you know. Even these die-hard Neanderthals, they are not insulated, you know. They might want to be insulated, but information kind of drags you in, you know, sucks you in. So, and I think if prices for oil drop, you know, Putin will be gone, you know, in 1-2 years, and the whole pyramid would collapse. Maybe Russian Federation will repeat the fate of Soviet Union. Maybe one of these borderland areas, they will secede somehow. You know, that's again, it's speculation.
Do you think this might accelerate that? Because now, now the European Union's talking about decreasing their independence or decreasing their dependence on Russian energy.
It's hard to do in practical terms, you know.
Yeah.
You can do it maybe in 25 years, you know. For instance, look, the United States should provide liquid gas. How can you do it? Until recently, see this because of this green ecological agenda, you know, it was impossible even to drill the oil, you know. Oh my goodness, they drill for gas, they drill for oil. You're criminals, you're capitalist criminals. That's how some people treat it. So there was not enough development of U.S. resources. But since right now the trend changed, so like, but it will take 20-25 years maybe, you know. It's but the prices for oil might drop naturally, you know, if we come up with suddenly with some alternative sources of energy. So far, it's not visible, you know. But who knows? So far, again, see, they can use these oil dollars to prolong the existence. Okay. But if you take this source away, what can you do, right? Everything will be gone, you know. So far, Putin can make buy the loyalty of people. He can purchase loyalty of people because the incomes of people increased. So that is why he is so popular. Compared to the 1990s, the Russians live much better. So he is, in all, he is associated in the minds of even people who don't like him as the person who brought stability to Russia after these years of anarchy in 1990s. Anarchic 1990s, this wild capitalism. So now it's stability. And they don't even know what was the source of the stability. It's again because prices for oil increased, you know. And they ascribe it to him, you know.